Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in the lives of the philosophers, I'm talking to the philosopher Alex Carter about the life and thought of Simone Weil. It was a remarkable life, and the thoughts pretty remarkable too. Her life was short, it was pretty fraught, it was also, given that it was short, extremely varied. And it has been profoundly influential. This is a very different kind of philosophy from the kind that we were discussing last time. She is nothing like A.J. Ayer, an unusual philosopher, an unusual life, a remarkable story. Before we get to the conversation with Alex about Simone Weil, again, a little bit about how this series fits together, or maybe you might think doesn't fit together. The jump from a philosopher like Ayer to a philosopher like Simone Weil is enormous, to the point where it almost doesn't feel like they're doing the same thing at all. These could not be more different kinds of philosophy. They could not be more different kinds of people. One of the online biographies of Simone Weil summarizes her at the beginning as, I quote, philosopher, mystic, political activist, labourer. Well, Ayer was a philosopher. He definitely wasn't a mystic. He might, in some contexts, have been a political activist. He was not a labourer, because labourer here means factory worker, as you'll hear. That is one of the things that Simone Weil did. She went to work in a factory to find out what real work was and what it meant. It's also miles away from A.J. Ayer in straightforwardly philosophical terms. Ayer was the enemy of theology passing itself off as philosophy. This is philosophy that comes pretty close to, and in many places directly overlaps with, theology, hence the label mystic. For some people, Weil's thought is pretty obscure. It can be hard to summarize, it can be hard to pin down. For other people, it is utterly profound, and it has been enormously influential. We are going to try to make sense of the thought, but the point of this series is to suggest that the thought makes more sense in light of the life, just as the life makes more sense in light of the thought. And that feels right for this story. Alex, we're going to be talking about the life of a philosopher who I think it's fair to say is one of those philosophers whose life obsesses people, including many of her admirers. It's a little like Wittgenstein, I think, in that for some at least, the life stands in for the philosophy. She's thought to have lived it, walked the walk as well as talking the talk. So before we get on to life, I'm just curious to know how you see that. I mean, do you think it's a little oversold, the way in which Simone Weil's life is seen to be the emblem of her philosophy? I want to get that established before we do it ourselves, in case I'm overselling it as well.
There's definitely a kind of relationship between the idea of a disciple-based philosophy, treating Wittgenstein like he's the gospel, of saying, well, Wittgenstein said, as if that settles the matter. Simone Weil, I don't think, has that. I don't think people quote her like she's gospel. I think they hold her up as a paragon. I think she has this emblematic quality. She is someone that we hold up as a kind of paragon of virtue or intellectual honesty or academic rigor or saintliness, as some people would put it. But I don't think she has disciples in quite the same way. And I think it's partly because her value does come from her values and not from the specific ideas that she puts forward. I think certain things she says are wonderful, and we'll talk about those, but I'm not sold on her Platonism, for instance. I'm not particularly interested in her views on Marxism so much. So we kind of pick and choose elements that we like. She's not a grand theory philosopher. She's not trying to come up with a theory of everything like so many philosophers have in the past. So I think there is something unique about her, and there's definitely something that draws people to her. She has a magnetic quality, and she has a kind of mystique around her. I think that's part of what is attractive about her philosophy. But I don't think it's her philosophy that gets disciples. I think it's her that becomes a kind of figure of attention for people.
And I suppose in that way, therefore, the life is possibly more significant even than the Wittgenstein case. Wittgenstein was not a saint, but he was ascetic. He lived in a certain way and he mesmerized people, not just in what he said. There are lots of reports of people meeting him for the first time, his eyes, the way he dressed, the look of him, the way he spoke. But as you say, he's treated like a gospel. She's treated more like a saint. And saints, the life is all important. So we're going to be talking about her life. Another way of asking the same question that I started with, is the life the embodiment of the philosophy? So even if it's not a life that attracts disciples, some saints do, some saints don't. Some saints live very solitary lives. But does the life, can it stand in for the philosophy, or do we have to do the philosophy as well?
I think those are slightly different questions. So when you say, does the life stand in for the philosophy? No. Can it? Yes. So one lens through which to understand a philosopher is to look at their life. Descartes is an interesting example. Here's a young boy who grew up saying to his father, I'm only going to accept things as true if I determine them for myself. Then what happens to him? He becomes a lawyer who's focused on precedent. He becomes a soldier who's given orders. This just galvanizes that feeling that he has. I think Simone Weil, equally as a child, is exhibiting certain of the traits that she'll have later in life. And these just get galvanized as she experiences what has to be the most kind of stressful moments in the history of mankind, going through the 20th century, and what she experienced being both a communist and a Jew and a woman at that period in history, just galvanizing certain aspects of her philosophy. So absolutely, it's a lens through which to understand her life. But at the same time, there are reductionists who will say things like, she had terrible headaches. Maybe she had neurological damage. Maybe she was mad. Does that make her less true? Nietzsche's madman who shouts, God is dead. It has to be a madman who speaks that truth. Why? Because we're all too sane to say it, but it is still true, at least at that time, in the way that Nietzsche wants it to be true. So Simone Weil speaks truths to us, whether she's mad or not. So again, the attempt to sort of root her philosophy in a kind of organic picture of her life, I'm always wary of doing biography by way of philosophy. But it's absolutely a way in which to understand it. And just to go back to the Wittgenstein point, he was definitely not a saint. He was a distinctly unpleasant person. For some reason, he was very likable, though, and people wanted to give their sofas to him for him to sleep on. I don't think Simone Weil had that attitude. In fact, distinctly, she was an unpleasant person to be around. Even people who would typically agree with her. Trotsky, for instance, couldn't bear to be around her and had to leave her home despite the invite. She wasn't welcoming of people into her zone. She was too intellectually honest. And I guess Wittgenstein had that too, but for some reason, maybe because he's a man, I don't know. Maybe it's something to do with his, the power of him. Maybe it's because he came from a very rich family and they thought wrongly that he might have some wealth. I don't know, but people gravitated towards him for whatever reason. I like to think it's the philosophy, but it could be other things.
So let me ask you about Weil's family background. You mentioned her childhood, her Jewishness. Unlike Wittgenstein, who came from an extremely large family, she came from a small, close-knit family. There was a brother and her two parents, and they were very close. Can you tell us a bit about the family and her childhood experiences?
Her Jewishness is probably the wrong term. Again, not picking on you, David. It's just that the use of the
You
word
pick
Jewishness
on me as
probably,
much as you like.
well, people have been picking on Weil for a very long time for a lack of Jewishness. So she was definitely Jewish, but interestingly, her and her brother grew up with no conception of what it meant to be a Jew. Andre Weil, as a boy, was told he was a Jew, and he had to ask, what does that mean? What is that? So that he absolutely grew up closely with his family, and his family exemplified, there was no friction there. So Weil encountered friction with the people she met, who very quickly, actually, in contrary to what I was just saying, did actually grow very close to her. So, for instance, her parents allowed her to join a fishing vessel, as her first foray into work, just because she wanted to experience labor, working with her hands and being manual and so on. But she's quite a frail young girl, and the fishing captain was sailing away when he saw her running through the waves with her skirts trailing in the waves and so on. I thought, I'm going to go back and pick her up. So he went back and picked her up. And then they became very close friends for a very long time. Likewise, when she went to work on a farm, having been ejected from the teaching profession by the Nazis in power over Vichy France, she was working as a farmer, as a communist amongst traditionally very conservative people, and they were sort of thinking, oh, I can't get on with this person, and immediately won them over as well. So there was this kind of, again, the intellectual honesty wins out eventually, but she's running up against people, but not her parents. Her professional parents, her Jewish by birth, but very free thinking, I think is the term that was often used at the time, intellectual people who invited her to think and question and challenge orthodoxies and all these sorts of things, and never even introduced her to the kind of orthodoxies of her faith, to the point where, yeah, she grew up in a very open and caring household, but faced with a brother who was also, and we'll get onto the question of genius shortly, but Andre Weil, who was a mathematical genius, and Weil very much contrasted herself in the negative against her brother, thinking her brother had access to a transcendental realm of divine truths that she had no access to. He's the genius, I'm not. These people are saintly, I'm not. Always casting herself in the negative. So there was this kind of inferiority aspect to her that ran throughout her life, constantly thinking she wasn't up for the task, constantly thinking she was too frail. And in many cases, physically, she was.
She was also prodigiously intelligent. Did she not, as a child, acknowledge, recognize her own even success at school? I think it's fair to say she was top of the class consistently. Did that not cut through her sense of inferiority?
Again, coming from a kind of accepting household, I don't think it did. I don't think she had a sense of inferiority or a sense of superiority. I think she just thought this is what to do. And her religiousness, what would eventually become her distinctly religious attitude, very much felt, well, it's never enough. I'm never good enough. Wittgenstein has a description of religious believers, which is that they don't so much think of themselves as incorrect as they are ill, and they kind of having the sense of wretchedness. I've got to keep striving, keep doing more. If you contrast her, for instance, with Kierkegaard, who was top of his class all the time until his father said, that's pride. Stop doing that. I want you to come second. So he did. So he worked out where all the other students were going to place and placed himself second in class. And you think the amount of intelligence required to do that is far exceeds the amount of intelligence it takes to just come first. So they never had any of that to deal with, no baggage associated with her intelligence, except this sense that mathematics was something excluded from her. So she certainly felt there were areas of intellect that she was not strong on. But there's no question she must have known she was particularly bright. She was willing to be a teacher. She was willing to engage people in debate. She would question, doubt very well recognized people, including Marx. So she was happy to question the profound thinkers of the day, but very much look up to people at the same time. Get a sense of something Kierkegaard did also not do. He very much just attacked the thinkers of his day.
We are going to come on to the content of the thought, but another question about her upbringing. And this is one of the things I think that also preoccupies people who are fascinated by her life. As you say, Jewish, but in denial about it. We're going to come on to her socialism and what that meant, but she was a woman. Was she also in denial about that in some sense? So one of the questions that's often asked about Weil is the roots of her asceticism, and some of it seems to have its origin in a childhood and an adolescence in which she seemed to have a complicated relationship with her own body, with her own femininity. As you say, she looked up to her brother, pure mathematical, but also crucially male in that world where he's living with numbers, and she maybe aspired to the clarity, the purity, the cleanliness of that. Where does the asceticism come from? Do we know? It's not easy to answer these psychological questions, but it is a marked characteristic of her life. She also was going to go on, we should say, and have a complicated relationship with food. We will talk about her death. Can you say when and how this aspect of her personality emerged?
It's undeniably innate, because when she, I think it was 3 years old, was given an heirloom from her grandmother of a kind of bejeweled ring, and she said, I'm not interested in material possessions, and handed it back. Age 3, so very much, this is not where I want to be. I'm not seeking wealth. She never at any point sought to do this. It was always labor work. It was the output of herself, never something to aggrandize herself, always something that she was giving away. It's one of the defining characteristics for some of her saintliness, is this capacity to give herself away all the time. And I think that characterizes her approach to material, whether it's food or whether it's wealth. That connects it to her asceticism more, I think, is this idea that I'm just not thinking of things for myself. That's not her first thought. Her first thought is always to give part of herself away, and therefore not that surprising that she, in a sense, wastes away. She said at the end of her life she felt as invisible as dead leaves. Well, essentially, she constructed that reality for herself by giving so much of herself away. So I think there is also a sense in which being born a Jew by race, if not by religion, there was a sense in which becoming a nun was ruled out for her, and being born into kind of a bourgeois, free-thinking family, again, not something that was likely to happen for her, but almost that would have been ideal, that she would have landed in that role, that she would have felt the solitude and the intellectualism of just spending her time thinking about God. Again, that was a late stage development in her life as well, as it was her conversion to Christianity. So there is this sense in which there was a pathway that may have led her in a certain direction, but history, her background, her family, these sorts of things would have ruled all that out, which again happens to millions of people. It doesn't make her unique. But certainly it was almost like that was fitted for her, and anything else was never going to satisfy.
We've talked a bit about the material conditions that shaped her. What were the ideas that shaped her? So, what were the intellectual influences on her? What kind of an education did she have? Did she have a classic French education in the philosophical greats? Was it a kind of from Plato on education?
Simone Weil makes her way into my philosophy as a underpinning of creativity theory. This idea that for her, that creation is an act of renunciation. It's allowing something to come to be. That's a very male perspective on things, or at least that's how it's been presented to me. And I don't deny that. Firstly, I'm a man. Secondly, I'm in a very male dominated subject. And so was she. You mentioned her feminism or her lack of feminism. She often asked her family to call her Simon, not Simone. So the male characteristic of the name. And she very much dressed as a male. And it may just be that, yeah, she was so taken up with these ideas that influenced her that it became a very male dominated way of thinking. Plato was clearly an influence on her. She's a Platonist in many respects, and not enough people, I think, talk about the Platonism of her thought. They turn to the Marxism, they turn to the religious aspect, but the Platonism jars with that in some ways, because Platonism we don't typically associate with either. We might associate it with Christian ethic, but we wouldn't necessarily associate it with her Christian ethic, and we wouldn't necessarily associate it with Marxism. The Republic having the philosopher king at the top of it, for instance, doesn't necessarily speak to giving people the capacity for labor, although there is that component in it. The idea of the Republic, the foundation of it, is about making sure that craftspeople and tradespeople have access and ability to own the product of their own labor. So again, you can start to see maybe where the threads of that would go, but very much she's taking it in the direction she wants to go in. But she was principally in her own day influenced not by Simone de Beauvoir, with whom she went to the École Normale Supérieure, the only two women in the class who came top of their class. Simone Weil first, Simone de Beauvoir was second again.
And not second in a Kierkegaard way. She wanted to be first, right?
Indeed, indeed. But then the 28 men who also wanted to be first following behind. So there is this very clear story of these very sharp intellects setting themselves up against men. They not so much, not in an agonistic way, certainly, setting herself up against them as she would set herself up against almost anyone's thinking in that day. Although, to be fair to Simone de Beauvoir, she wasn't exactly in agreement with how women of the day thought either. She very much wanted a new kind of feminist attitude to the world. So it wasn't a solidarity picture. It was very much I'm going to lead, you need to follow. But Simone Weil would have had a lot more time for people who didn't attend the École Normale Supérieure. Her falling out with Simone de Beauvoir, for instance, when she was talking about the nature of existence preceding essence. And so you can kind of just get over your hunger. And she said, "You've clearly never been hungry," said Simone Weil to Simone de Beauvoir. So this idea of, we can just do whatever we want. It's like, yeah, you've got a very bourgeois attitude to this, though, a very intellectualist attitude towards what we need to do. The uprising is not going to come from the top, from people having the right ideas. It's going to come from people realizing that they're being oppressed and seeking the grace that comes from rising up. And up in not necessarily in a violent sense, but in a sense of we need to regain the control we have over our lives. We need our autonomy. We need our liberty. We need to reject this oppressive structure that we find ourselves in.
That idea of Platonism, coupled with the idea that you've just described, which is you have a bourgeois or elite or rarefied attitude, it's not grounded or rooted, and we'll come on to the question of rootedness, but it's not grounded in everyday human experience, including physical experience. Just explain to me how those two things go together. In a sense, the Platonism suggests a kind of rarefied idea or ideal version of what it is to understand the world, the universe. And at the same time, here we have a woman who's saying to one of her classmates, who she's just beaten in the exams, or later on when they'll both have been aware of it, you don't get it because with you, it's all thought, it's all head, it's not enough the physical, the body. Are those things in tension, or are they consistent, the Platonism and the physicality of this?
I remember being shocked when I read that Simone Weil said to truly understand an object, you sit in front of it, stare at it, and say, "What is it?" And what she's actually describing, weirdly, is something very similar to what, at the same time, Henry Bergson, or Henri Bergson, depending on whether it's English or French, he was half of each. But Henri Bergson would talk about the idea of having sympathy for one's object, and it's about giving oneself over to the object. And when I read that, I understood Simone Weil's position better. And so she is highly intellectual, but she is also about the intellect can't go inward. It must go outward. And this was also a Platonic notion, the idea of orientation. Don't stay in the cave. You have to reorient yourself to turn around to see that the shadows on the wall are fake. You have to see that there's a light casting these shadows, and then realize that even the light pales in comparison to the light outside the cave. And you have to orient yourself upwards and outwards and move your way out. So this is a very kind of physical, it's what she called attention. This idea of attention to one's object requires you to orient yourself in a certain way. So there's a subtlety of her philosophy that's not propositional. It's not analytic in that kind of philosophical sense, which again, I think is why later Wittgensteinians like myself are kind of drawn to her philosophy, not because it's rooted in a kind of logical analysis, which is, the world is made up of ideas, and if we boil these all away, we're left with nothing. But rather, the world is made up of actions and deeds and doing things and orientations and judgments and attitudes and things before we even get to questions of opinions and definitions and things like that. So I think the orientation thing mattered for her. And the other way in which that comes out with the body is in Plato, there's this idea of mind, heart, stomach, or brain, heart, stomach, if we want to get purely physical. But this idea of aligning your thoughts with your passions, with your appetites. And again, I would suggest that Simone Weil didn't get those things aligned for reasons that we talked about already, her kind of rejection of material wealth, rejection of eating enough food when she needed it, those sorts of things. But a kind of dogged, but maybe she herself would have been guilty of the same kind of criticism she applied to Simone de Beauvoir, that she was constantly prioritizing thought a bit too much and not her own physical care. But again, it was still that alignment that she was interested in, and that the body does matter.
Was the assumption that the thing that had to be paid attention to was always on the outside? Because obviously there is a version of philosophy where the thought is the way to get to the truth is to interrogate one's own thoughts, to go inside, to look inside the brain or the mind, or whichever combination of those two things you think it is, but that philosophy is a very self-reflective activity. Even though she was a highly intellectual philosopher, was the assumption that the truth is to be found out there, not in here?
She was devoted to a kind of individualism. It was one of the reasons that she rejected a Marxist picture that placed the community before the individual. I think she very much felt that the individual is where it's at. She was a kind of syndicalist rather than a communist. She believed that we should form unions, but it starts with the individual. So there is a sense in which it does begin with organizing one's own house, getting oneself right in terms of one's desires, one's wishes. So the desire for good being itself a good, for instance, she says, which is a very Platonic notion. No one wills evil. No one thinks that evil is a good thing to do and then does it, because if it was a good thing, it wouldn't be evil, would it? So the idea that the desire for good is itself a good is unique amongst desires. Therefore, the sovereignty of the good, as Iris Murdoch put it, but this idea that the good must come first. So that's a kind of reorienting of oneself. And then the state reorganizes around that. And again, that's also quite a Platonic notion. Just as Plato had mind, passion, appetite, so too does the Republic, that the philosopher king is in charge, followed by the arts and things that elicit passion, and then the crafts which kind of feed the appetite. So organizing the state in line with the individual is also a kind of common trend within philosophy. I think she could be said, no, this is the first time I'm having this thought, but it could be said that she's making that kind of plea to people. Certainly she wrote The Need for Roots, which de Gaulle had asked her to write a new constitution for France, the problem being that he read it And that meant that he didn't want anything to do with it because he was imagining, I think, another ite, egalite, liberté, fraternité, and I don't know, some other ite. And she added 60,000 words of, much more Marxist ways of thinking and giving dignity back to workers and so on. No, 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 none of this, please. But she did clearly have an intention to try and find our place in an environment, in a world. So again, yes, connecting ourselves with the outside matters, but she does start from ourselves. What she does is she kind of works outwards from the self. So I need to understand what I am doing, how it works within my street, within my region of a city, within the city itself, within the region of a country, within the country itself, within the world. How do we orient ourselves today? We think about world news, we think about national news, we think about local news, and then we think about my own personal news. And it might be your personal news as important as the world news, but you don't ever get that sense of connectivity between those things. So we don't feel what she would call rooted in our lives. We feel uprooted and disconnected from our lives.
I want to ask you about work because we've touched on this. And I think, again, for the people who are fascinated with her life, one of the things that they tend to fixate on is the fact that she chose 4 periods to be a labourer, to work in a factory. She opted out of the intellectual academic life, despite the fact she was clearly physically ill-suited to it. She's very short-sighted. She was a menace, to be honest, and we'll come on to her as a soldier, which is even worse. But as a labourer, as a factory worker, but she felt it had to be experienced. What was the thinking about work or about labour that informed those life choices?
So I said that she opposed Marxism. She opposed it for a number of reasons, and not least because she saw what happened in Russia. And people had said to her, we want what they had. We want another, October Revolution here. We want the spread of communism. And she wrote a very sober letter back to the person who had expressed this to her, saying, "You've no idea how bad it is for the workers in Russia. It's so much worse than you would imagine it would be here. This is the saddest thing for me to express to you, but this has not worked. It is not a successful project there. We can maybe do it here, but it is not going to happen the same way. So please get it out of your head that this is a good thing and stop." She said the root of all evil is daydreaming, wanting the world to be other than it is. Not, oh, I wish I had this or wish I had that. It's just, I wish that the world was other than it actually is. So this kind of fierce intellectual honesty makes her drive down into what is it that would actually lead to a proper revolution that would free people from oppression. And so she wants to understand the oppression. So she goes to work in one of the factories where people work. And she discovers very quickly what it was. She discovers that she doesn't have a clue what she's doing or why she's doing it. All the things I just said about rootedness, she has none of them. She's making lamps. Why? For what? No idea. Is it even a lamp that she's building? She doesn't know. She's just connecting this thing to this thing. The women that she's working with, they wake up, they make breakfast for the family, they get the kids to school, they go to work, they work very long days, they go home, they make dinner for the family, they put the kids to bed, they collapse. They wake up, cycle continues. And it's just that doesn't enable any chance of a revolution because you can't build a revolution on apathy. So the sheer apathy that the grinding, being turned. So for instance, where Marx promotes industrialism, she's against industrialism because this is alienating of labor in exactly the same way that capitalism is seen as alienating for Marx. Well, so is this kind of industrialization, because once I see myself as a cog in a system, but I don't actually understand the system, what's the point? So I become a thing. And that's something that she's going to vehemently reject, something which Hegel before Marx would have actually quite favored, this idea that actually, it's agency and autonomy that we desperately need to protect. I think Weil has more in common perhaps with Hegel than she does with Marx on this. But definitely this idea that labor was necessary as an experiment for her to understand, as she called out Simone de Beauvoir for not understanding the people that she's trying to free from oppression. Likewise, she doesn't understand, but she's now going to do something about that and get out there and find out. Simone de Beauvoir may well have done likewise, I don't know enough, but I would say that Simone Weil here in this particular instance is a good example of doing that, of trying to find out. And again, the war would be another good example of that. I have to find out, am I up for this challenge? And very quickly discovering she's not, but how would she know that unless she tried?
So we'll come on to the Spanish Civil War. It's the contrast that she tried to draw, and you've touched on this language, between labour and, say, craft. I mean, there's a version of this in Hannah Arendt. We won't do that here, but the distinction that has to be drawn is between kinds of work, and some kinds of work are repetitive, deadening, alienating. But other kinds of work, for some people, it's with your hands. For some people, it's you have agency over the thing that you produce. For some people, it's the scale, it's small scale. Was there in her thought a vision of a society organized around, I don't know, craft workshops and small communities, which might be a little utopian, but is that where this is heading?
It's definitely heading towards certain Marxist pictures of workers owning the means of production because they have to be their tools. I have to see this as an extension of me and an extension of my projects, which is not a Marxist idea, of course, because again, that's far too individualistic. It's far too centered on the individual. But for her, that is a pathway to this, that I have to see this as something I'm putting into a system and understanding, and maybe that's an overly intellectual notion, I don't know, but this idea of understanding how it all fits together, what this is part of a project of. So that I think that for me is more where she's going with this. I also suspect what she's after is not so much a kind of process or product related sense of value. It's not art versus craft. It's she doesn't use this word because it wasn't even a word at the time, but creativity, I would say, is probably perhaps what she's getting at here is this sense of, or what later became self-actualization and these sorts of things, Maslow's notion of self-actualization, that I've got to fulfill my potential as a person, which is odd for someone who is expecting us to give ourselves away or requires us to give ourselves away through our faith. So there's an interesting juxtaposition of this idea of becoming who you are to only then have to give that away. But that contradiction, philosophy isn't free of those kinds of contradictions. They're everywhere. And I think she's willing to sort of confront that contradiction and live it.
She lived the life of an intellectual. She was a teacher. She was a writer. She wasn't, I think, ever an ivory tower intellectual because it did also involve journalism and pamphleteering, letter writing, all the rest of it. But she did move in and out of that life and then the lived experience of the things that she was meant to be trying to understand. For people who want to mock her, and I think there are quite a lot of people who want to mock her, the Spanish Civil War experience is probably the prime exhibit of this. This young woman who was determined to go and fight, but brought her parents with her, I think I'm right in saying. She didn't last long. She was an absolute menace to the people among whom she was. She was fighting on the Republican side, I think with the Durruti column, is that right, at one point? So with the anarchists, with the artists, the creatives, but she had her parents in tow. Reminds me a bit of when people want to mock Thoreau, they always point out that when he went off into the woods, he still had, I think, his sister or his mother doing his washing for him. Is it serious? She nearly died, but it does look, again, to use a horrible word, it looks a little performative.
So on that, so I think firstly, she's the least ivory tower. She used to go down mines to teach the miners because she knew they weren't getting an education. How less ivory tower could that be? But at the same time, yes, there is this juxtaposition with the intellectuals, Orwell, etc., who are going out to fight in the Spanish Civil War. You know, the kind of the idea of the pen being mightier than the sword. Well, let's try the sword for a bit. Holidaying in warfare or something like that. Firstly, she's desperately trying to help people, right? Which is very much how many people describe their own joining up for military service today. You know, that I'm not here to kill, I'm here to save lives. That's my goal. And I think that was her goal going in. Burning her foot in a cooking fire, etc., suggests that yes, she wasn't best suited to outdoors life. I think might be a better way of putting it. Warfare, again, probably not her best zone of expertise. But at the same time, if people want to mock that, fine. I would say that the perfect example of probably ivory tower thinking is doing a podcast, sorry, David, on an intellectual rather than, getting out there and taking on these challenges ourselves. So we could equally be accused of the same. And I think that humility is also part of her message, this idea that there's a kind of commonality, a need for us to, why should their fighting of the war, why should anyone else have to fight in that war and not her? I think that's how she would have pictured it.
There is also something very touching about the fact that her relationship with her parents remained close throughout her life. They let her do these things, and the image of them following along behind to slightly clean up afterwards, you can mock it, but you can also be deeply moved by it, actually.
Oh, absolutely. And I suspect it's less her asking them to come and that more the constant presence of them picking her up when she did try and do things that were well beyond her capacity. Right. Again, it's kind of the frailty of her physical form. She uses this image, I think it was a fig tree that produced no fig, the barren tree. And she says, it's completely barren. It's a sad tree to behold, but it has no excuse. And you think, what? It has no excuse. It reminds me a little bit, actually, having, sort of talked about Simone de Beauvoir and that form of existentialism. Sartre says when someone gives in to dehydration, a hiker, and collapses, they do this by choice. He's claiming that we can overcome dehydration through will. And it feels like she wants to try and do this as well. She's almost proof that that existential picture just does not hold. Because if there was a will that could have joined the war and done well at it, it would have been her will. But her body, absolutely not. And so her parents come following behind because she is still that child who will just wander into a situation and find herself completely out of her depth physically. Mentally, they would never have followed her. I doubt very much they would have been interested in following her into her classes in the École Normale Supérieure. They wouldn't have dreamt of sitting down with her and Émile Chartier to sit down and debate things with them. That's her domain. But when they hear that she's going off to war, they're like, oh, okay, we're coming. That's the sentiment I think it conveys, yeah.
When and how does Christianity enter this story, and in what form? So there are, in accounts of her life, stories of conversion moments, moments of revelation. Is that what we're talking about here? And is it part of that ascetic saintly thing that there were points, and I'm sure there'll be people who try and explain it because she was starving or whatever it is, but she had visions.
It was late in her life, which is to say at a young age, because she didn't die at an old age, so she was 34. But it was later in that period that Christ took possession of her, she says. So she had a divine experience of Christ taking her around Paris. And many people, this is where I find most people looking to mock her. And it reminds me a little bit of people mocking Descartes when he says, maybe God tricks me into thinking that 2 plus 2 equals 4, to which I respond, all Descartes is saying is that you didn't make 2 plus 2 equal 4. So if you didn't make it the case, then you're dependent upon something, and you can call it the world, you can call it God, you can call it fate, you can call it mathematics, it doesn't matter, but the point is it's not you. And I feel like similarly, this attempt to ridicule her is almost just because, so what would that even mean? And maybe she's just mad. She had these terrible headaches, as we were alluding to. She's working in this factory. She's got poor eyesight. She has terrible headaches throughout her life. I can't think of any place that would have been worse. So her experience in the factory is probably worse than other people's. Contrast that with her much worse performance in the war. She'll find herself in any situation, no matter how hard it is on her, to try and do what others are trying to do as well. And I think so it's a similar kind of situation in the factory and the warfare, but equally always going through in this frail state, in this mentally challenged state of this really difficult, painful headaches where it makes it impossible to speak or even think. And so all she used to do when she had these headaches was intone a particular poem, George Herbert's Love, and would recite this poem as a way of getting through the pain. So I think that's what she's engaging in there. And again, the religious experience aspect of this, I would again go back to the point that her theology is the most profound theology I've come across. Now, if it takes a mad person to produce a profound theology, then let's start talking to mad people about theology. And by the way, I know that the term mad is not a particularly popular one. It is, however, the word that is often attached to her for this purpose. But we don't know. And that's the point. We don't know. This is why I can't specify the neurodivergence or the particular illness that she had, because we honestly don't know what it was. So we can try and diagnose post factum, or we could just simply use this word mad to describe the fact that, yeah, maybe she had very unexpected experiences. But when she talks to you about your faith, when she tries to convert you, she says, unless you've had similar experiences, don't believe in God. And this goes for Christians too. The pathway to God is not through creating a false idol, which is daydreaming again, because that's only going to obscure your vision. It's going to stop you encountering God as God actually is. It's much more important that you have the vision as it is. Now, she may have had that vision in a number of different ways. She actually writes a letter to someone who is in tremendous pain. He has shrapnel in his spine from the First World War and is in constant pain, Louis Bosquet. And what's miraculous about this is that the letter still exists, because the letter she wrote says how lucky he is, that he is reminded all the time of his material nature. And he therefore only needs to reorient himself very slightly She says there's a kind of thin shell between himself and reality, and all it will take is a tiny effort on his part to break through that shell, to encounter the world exactly as it is, rather than escaping to a kind of, but maybe this is happening to me for a reason. No, 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 don't do that. Don't do that. Confront it exactly as it is, and you will have the divine revelation. And that divine revelation isn't a bearded man with a promise of better life to come. None of that. It's indifference. It's God's absence from our material natures, which gives us recognition of God's existence through a kind of contrast. It's what she calls the bond of separation. The fact that we are so removed from God gives us that experience of God. But precisely therefore, her experience is a weird kind of, her own theology is rooted in this idea of you're not supposed to have these experiences, but she did. And so there's a very interesting kind of, I mean, it's not contradictory. It's just this very interesting tension that we encounter when I haven't had Jesus Christ take possession of me, but I come to her reading and I can see the religious significance of it. And I'm not a religious believer myself, but I do defend religious belief because what she is describing is profoundly meaningful in precisely the way that Camus encountered it to be profoundly meaningful and couldn't quite reject it, but nor could he completely embrace it. And that's how I feel myself.
And it is Christianity outside the church. She was not a joiner. Institutions made her uncomfortable in all of their various forms. Is it fair to say there was no institutional dimension to her philosophy or her theology?
There's a recent discovery of which I know little, but she allegedly was baptized very late. This was something apparently that happened. I'm less interested in that than, as you say, than the lived experiences she's had up until that point where she was rejecting the church. What church would have had her, I think, is a good question. If the communists wouldn't have her, if Trotsky wouldn't have her, despite her ardent, almost too extreme form of freeing of oppression, then how could that possibly come about that she would enter into a church? I've often wondered the other way round. Rowan Williams, who was the head of the Church of England, well, not the head of the Church of England, but the Archbishop of Canterbury, was a Valian. And I've often wondered, how does that tension exist? Or is a Valian, I should say. So there's lots of people who are Valians who are also within a church, and I wonder how that tension works out for them. And again, I'm not critiquing them, I'm not challenging them on this, I'm just suggesting that they would have found that slightly awkward. This idea of reject this but embrace this at the same time.
She died during the Second World War, so she didn't live to see what was revealed afterwards about the worst things that happened, but she saw enough of it. And as you say, she lived through many of the worst experiences or worst times that human beings have inflicted on themselves. How did she understand evil in this context? So when she, for instance, looked at the Nazis, what did she see?
The view that I find most difficult to debate is theodicy or apologetics, the attempt to explain evil away. So basically, to explain why a child gets leukemia. I find any attempt to explain this about the most repellent thing I can possibly find. The existence of leukemia to me pales in comparison to human attempts to justify it. And so what does she offer as a way of theology that is, for instance, philosophers like Camus can embrace, and Wittgensteinians, who Wittgenstein also had this difficult relationship with religion. He said he was felt cut off from religion. But this idea of what is it that's so appealing about it is the non-apologetic nature of her faith, that we love God not despite suffering, but because we suffer. And the love of God is not love him and he will look after us. It's no matter what happens to us, and I mean all the worst things in the world could happen to us, but it's all okay if it does. So this terrible thing could happen, but it's okay. It's all right. That sense of viewing the world from outside, viewing the world sub specie aeternitatis, as many great philosophers have used that phrase. So Spinoza uses the phrase, Kierkegaard uses the phrase, Wittgenstein uses the phrase, and this idea of stepping outside of the world to view it this way. And there's a quote I'll just briefly read from Simone Weil, which I think captures some aspects of this. She says, "The sea," as in the ocean, "the sea is not less beautiful in our eyes because we know that sometimes ships are wrecked by it. On the contrary, this adds to its beauty. If it altered the movement of its waves to spare a boat, it would be a creature gifted with discernment and choice, and not this fluid, perfectly obedient to every external pressure. It is this perfect obedience that constitutes the sea's beauty." So it's in necessity and indifference that we find beauty, and we find the godly or the divine. It's not in God entering the world, which would then essentially, as she says, unmake it, because God's creation of the world is precisely allowing us to exist. which is not giving us free will, as many people have framed it. It's just allowing something else other than God to exist. So it's a complete renunciation to allow it to be. And within that renunciation is the beauty of the divine. And again, to me, that's a profoundly religious message, one that I could absolutely understand someone orienting their entire life according to. What I can't understand is someone orienting their life and also just having to have this exercise that they do every once in a while where they justify these most terrible of evils that happen.
So this is probably the naive or crude way of putting it, but the suffering that was everywhere in the early 1940s, the last years of her life, and that she was aware of and witnessed, that suffering was itself part of, I don't even know how to put this, but that suffering was consistent with her understanding of what it is to be human and also what it is to be human in relation to the divine. And that suffering's not, it's not a good thing, it's not something to be explained, it's not certainly not something to be explained away. And she may write to someone with a terrible spinal injury, you're lucky, but she's not going to write to the people in the concentration camps that you're lucky. But nonetheless, there is a perspective from which this is what it means to be human in relation to the divine.
It's looking away, right? Looking away would be the mistake. To look away from the Holocaust or from evil or from suffering. And this is precisely what she doesn't do. So her notion of grace and of moral attitude is she tells the story of the Holy Grail, which is given to the person who asks the king, "What are you going through?" Not in order to get the Grail, not in order to look like they care, not in order to make the king feel better even, just to fully give themselves over to someone else to understand their suffering and their pain. And she does say this is a miracle on the level of turning oxygen into gold, which again I feel is a tension. It's a problem for us to be asked to be saints. But again, she's asking herself to be a saint. She said, the world needs saints who are also geniuses. She didn't think that was her, although T.S. Eliot, when he published her work here, described her precisely as that, a saint and a genius. Many people have described her this way, but she was very much not of that view. She didn't think she was saintly because she couldn't give herself enough, because she didn't have enough to give. She was too frail. She wasn't a genius because her brother is a genius and because other people, have this level of genius. She's cut off from this kind of knowledge. So what does it become? Suffering. The one subject of her analysis is suffering, or, as I should be more correct, affliction. Affliction is suffering without any purpose. Christians who went into the Colosseum singing were suffering because they were suffering for their God. Christ was afflicted. Why? Because he died, and these are her words, like a beggar, only slightly more ridiculous. His death had no more significance than a pine needle falling, she says. The final words of Christ are, "Father, why have you forsaken me?" What's the significance of that? Well, it connects creation with crucifixion now, because the idea is that Christ is experiencing the gulf between himself and God. He's as far away from God as you can be in that moment. And it's that bond of separation that separates them. And she uses this analogy of two prisoners in neighboring cells. They communicate by tapping on the wall. The wall is what separates them, but it's also what allows them to communicate. And so experiences of affliction specifically, not suffering because it comes with that kind of daydreaming aspect that the reason this wall is here is for a reason, rather than just thinking the wall is here and then communicating using it. So once you can do that, once you can use affliction as a kind of means of deriving meaning from meaninglessness, which is a creative act, then you've got something that you can build a profound faith on. But it doesn't come about through kind of wish casting or wanting the world to be other, wanting to live for longer. As Wittgenstein put it, what answers come from having more life? If life is a puzzle, why would more of it help? And Simone Weil would be very much in line with that same way of thinking. It's not helpful.
One of the reasons why de Gaulle was going to be disappointed if he wanted a sort of updated liberté, égalité, fraternité, is that she rejected all systems of thought that abstracted away from human experience. And so not just orthodox, deterministic, Marxist, industrial strategy, but also straightforwardly regimes of rights. She traced a lot of the ills of the world back to the Romans, partly because they created the idea of law and rights. And I think that's one of the things that in our world people find most challenging or threatening about her thought, which is she really rejects most of the building blocks of what we think of as good humanitarian regimes. She is not for human rights. She's for the human, but she's not for human rights because the rights bit of it is an abstraction from the human bit. It's actually a very, very radical philosophy.
It's radical, but not in a vandalizing way. So, for instance, it's more that we have wish casted ourselves rights. Where did these come from? How easy is it to deny that we have rights? I'll do it right now. We don't have them. That was hard. Now we have no rights. It has to be more substantial than that. We have to look for something more significant than that. So, reason also is what determines rights. This is a Kantian philosophy where rights come about through establishing through intellectualism what I have to commit myself to in general. The other thing is rights preceding obligations imply that in order for you to have an obligation to a thing, it must have a right. But ascribing rights to the ancient oak on the village green, or to the pyramids, or to the Mona Lisa, ascribing rights to those things is an incredibly difficult thing to even conceive of and make sense of. It's easier to do it with people because they have obligations to me, but it's hard to do to an object. The reason that obligations precede rights is because obligations arise through agency. So most people would say, well, what if I don't have free will? It doesn't matter. If you deny that you have agency, that's the very agency that I'm appealing to, your denial. So immediately you can either injure me or not injure me. So now, because of that agency, you have to work out which of those things you have to do. And only through that process does it then, and this is very much the line that Simone Weil is taking, that beginning with agency, beginning with something which is harder than reason because it can't be doubted. It's very easy to call into question reason. And also, most people assume that reason precedes agency. This is one of the most common errors in philosophy. Reason preceding agency is so wrong because reason requires agency. In order to think, I would have to choose to think if it was an action. Whereas if I just say I can act, right? So again, agency just coming first, then one of those actions can be to think, and that makes more sense. So agency coming first, this idea that we have this diamond hard sense of agency, that you can't deny it because the denial would be an affirmation of it. That sense of agency, build an ethics out of that, and you're on much firmer ground than if you build it on a thought system that was from Rome or from Kant or from someone who is fundamentally flawed and who you can't really make use of anyway. You can't really come up with many of these categorical imperatives that everyone must follow.
I want to ask two more questions. She went to the United States with her parents during the Second World War briefly, but she came back. I think she left them there and came back. It looks a bit like they weren't taking care of her. She was taking care of them. She came back to join the Free French and to work with people around de Gaulle, but she also became ill quite quickly in England. And as you say, she died aged 34. And her death is part of her myth, or it's part of her story. For some people, she starved herself to death. She's said to have said she wouldn't eat any more than prisoners of war were being fed. She couldn't bear to have more food than the people who were suffering, and yet she was ill. She needed to eat more to get better. So she may have killed herself. She may not have killed herself. How much does the death matter? Does it matter how we interpret her death? For instance, does it matter whether we ascribe agency to the circumstances of her death?
I don't know. I don't know if my view on that matters. I would be very interested in why someone might think it does matter. The idea that she chose to die, I think, would be fallacious, just on the grounds that if she was fully healthy and walking through the streets, she wouldn't have gone immediately into a pharmacy and bought the means by which she could then dispatch herself. So she wasn't looking to die. She may not just have been that interested in living. I make a similar argument with regard to Socrates that, yes, he died by his own hand. Yes, he had multiple opportunities to escape. Yes, he may even made his trial. He kind of sabotaged his own trial and made it almost guaranteed that he would be put to death. But he didn't want to die, and he genuinely would have been perfectly happy if the state had paid him to continue existing as he had existed before, philosophizing and telling people all the same things that he told them before. And I feel like Simone Weil, if the war had ended and they said, we can all go back home now, she might well have thought, okay, well then give me the neurothorax, give me the food to live, and I'll go back. Because now I'm less worried about rationing and I'm more interested in supporting my country through this. So 1943 was a low ebb in the war as well. It's worth noting that. I mean, it was around this point that things started to improve for the Allies, but it may well have felt very hopeless for her at that time, especially when ill. So again, we can treat her like the courts treated her and say she was in a sanatorium, she was unwell, she refused medicine, she refused treatments, she refused food, she died. Let's put it down as a suicide. She's put in a pauper's grave. She isn't even given a name for something like 15 years until someone puts her name on the grave. So there's a sense in which, she feels more disposable to the state through the systems there. And again, she wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. She's as invisible as dead leaves, she says, and that's essentially how then she did die. So she was accurate up until her last moments in terms of her assessment of her own life. I don't think it's suicide, and if we did class it as suicide, it's not heroic suicide, a kind of Captain Oates type situation. It's not a forced suicide like Socrates. It's not, if we want to call that suicide as well. I just feel like it's more the life had kind of gone out of her. She'd given everything away. Like I said, this was more like with the war, like with the working in the factory, like with the giving away of the jewelry, like all the other aspects of her life. It's easier to fit it into a pattern of she just never had a concern for herself. It was always going to be a concern for others. So why would I need this treatment? It may also be, let's be frank, that the philosophy becomes a kind of toxin in this particular instance, that philosophy can kill if the idea is affliction is responded to by orientation as opposed to by eating and getting treatment. If your response is to orientation, maybe it's that. I don't know. But it doesn't feel like the kind of death that happens when someone refuses medical treatment on religious grounds. It feels more like a just complete lack of concern for herself.
She was not particularly well known for many years after her death. Her reputation, indeed her legend, has grown. She is now enormously influential, revered, mocked. But as you say, as she said of Christ, I think the mockery wouldn't touch the sides. Like mockery? Well, fine, mock away. But she's also the subject of quite a lot of fierce controversy in the way, I think, with people who are borderline saintly. She disappoints people in the sense that they want more from her. It's hard to see what more a life like that could have given, as you've just described her death. But people want more from her. They want her to have made more public statements. They want her to have been clearer about her Jewishness and the plight of the Jews. There's something really weird about how people attach onto these kind of philosophical lives and the thought that goes with them such expectations that you say you're a saint, so why aren't you out there, playing my game? But it's true, isn't it? She is a lightning rod for various controversies.
On the mockery thing, I would just say it feels actually like if you mock they, it's a little bit like when Monty Python were accused of mocking Jesus in Life of Brian, and they said, "What is there to mock? Be kind to others." Ha ha ha! Great laugh. There's nothing to mock. It's misguided. Why would you expect her to be more than she is? She might be less than you hope, but she's not less than she is. So precisely what she is, and what you're mocking might not be her. It might be some sort of straw person. On the controversy thing, I mean, writing the letter to the Nazi regime to say thank you for giving me back the land when she was made a labourer and taken away from teaching. Again, I can promise you this, if we didn't know about what was going on in the camps in the UK at that time, I promise you the people in Vichy France wouldn't have known either. And again, that's not me making excuses for her. Even if she had have known, she's still correct in saying she was grateful for being given back the land. She also wrote a letter denying her Jewishness. And again, her brother didn't even know what it meant to be a Jew. So to her, it would be the strangest thing in the world. Imagine if someone came to you and they said, "We're going to round you up because you're rhesus negative," and you'd never heard of such a thing. But what do you mean? I'm rhesus negative. I don't know what that even means. You'd write a letter saying, "Excuse me, but I don't really see this as an important part of my identity. Sorry." So denying that I don't feel like is turning her back on her Judaism, etc., or her Jewish roots. They're not really even there. So I guess I would say with the controversies is I think it's wrong to focus on them, but it is very indicative of the times that we live in. So I think it tells us an awful lot about how we're living today, that we look to identity and say she wasn't feminist enough, she wasn't pro-Judaism enough, she wasn't doing enough for her compatriots in France, she wasn't doing enough for. These weren't the battles that she was choosing to fight. Look at the battles that she was choosing to fight, and how could she have done more? I mean, as we discovered in the Spanish Civil War, she chose to fight that one and was not particularly successful. We could mock her for that as well. But again, if she'd gone in like a supreme Ubermensch, then she'd won the war for the communist fighters. So what? Would we suddenly now think she was a better saint and genius because she was an awesome general? So again, I worry a little bit that we kind of impose weird standards on what she's asking for us. In terms of her heritage, I think people like T.S. Eliot and Camus have done a much better job in thinking about what was it that she actually contributed, what lines of thought was she important to, and what wasn't she important to. I am very pleased that today many people are looking at the need for roots as a kind of new manifesto for the left, something that is desperately needed, not least because on the left today, many people are kind of hearkening back to a time which we simply don't live in, with the roots of the labour movement and where it came from, the kinds of times when she was living and the kinds of oppression that people were under. We need a kind of new manifesto that picks up that. Why would we therefore find it in vain? Well, because she was timeless. She did actually attend to things as they were, as opposed to as she wanted them to be. So it wasn't, she was always a Platonist in that respect as well, coming to the world from a 0 point and thinking, what's the correct answer as opposed to what's the right answer now?
Next time, in the lives of the philosophers, someone who is not always considered a philosopher, but we are going to suggest that he was, among other things. I'm talking again to Alex Carter about another French writer, thinker, and philosopher. It's Albert Camus. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.